Rain soaked Lillian Hicks's hair as Valeria Whitmore threw her suitcase onto the marble steps like it was trash. Behind the glowing windows of the mansion, people in tuxedos still laughed over champagne, while her husband stood in the doorway beside his mistress and said absolutely nothing. "You own nothing here," Valeria said coldly. "Not the house, not the company, not my son." Lillian's hands trembled around the leather work bag pressed against her chest. They had taken her credit cards, her car, her access to every account. What they didn't know was that inside that bag sat the one document capable of destroying the Whitmore empire. And for the first time in years, Lillian stopped crying. If you've ever watched someone mistake kindness for weakness, this story is going to hit hard. Stay until the end, because the moment they thought they buried her was the moment she became dangerous. Lillian Hicks used to believe that love sounded like sacrifice. It sounded like waking up at 5 in the morning to iron Kurt Whitmore's shirts before investor meetings because he claimed nobody else did it right. It sounded like smiling politely while his mother criticized the way she held a wine glass at charity dinners. It sounded like putting her own career on hold, temporarily, for a marriage that slowly consumed every ambitious part of her until all that remained was a woman everyone took for granted. And somehow, over the years, she had mistaken survival for devotion. The Whitmores lived in a gated community outside Greenwich, Connecticut, where every house looked like it belonged on the cover of Architectural Digest. Their mansion sat at the end of a winding, private drive lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and imported Italian fountains. Inside, everything gleamed white marble floors, gold fixtures, museum-worthy paintings, cold beauty. That was what Lillian always thought the house represented. Cold beauty, the kind that impressed strangers while quietly suffocating the people living inside it. She stood in the kitchen one morning, arranging fresh lilies in a crystal vase, when Valeria Whitmore entered wearing an ivory silk robe worth more than most people's monthly rent. Valeria glanced at the flowers. "Lilies again," she asked. "You really do have such aggressively middle-class taste." Lillian kept her expression neutral. "I can change them." "No," Valeria replied smoothly. "It's almost charming at this point." The insult landed exactly how it was intended to. Soft enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. Valeria walked to the espresso machine without another glance at her. For 7 years, Lillian had lived inside conversations like that. Tiny cuts, daily humiliations, little reminders that no matter how loyal she would never truly belong to the Whitmore family. At first, Kurt used to defend her. Back when they were dating in Chicago, before Whitmore Holdings exploded into one of the fastest growing luxury development firms on the East Coast, he would hold her hand under restaurant tables and whisper things like, "You're the only real thing in my life." Back then, he sounded sincere. Back then, Lillian believed him. She met Kurt when she worked in corporate compliance for a legal consulting firm. He was charming, ambitious, magnetic, in the way men from wealthy families often were. He had this ability to make people feel chosen, special. Lillian had been careful with him at first. Men like Kurt Whitmore didn't usually marry women like her. She came from a middle-class family in Ohio. Her father was a public school principal. Her mother worked nights as a nurse. No trust funds, no country clubs, no powerful last name. Just intelligence, discipline, kindness. But Kurt pursued her relentlessly. Flowers at work, long flights just to see her for dinner, late-night confessions about how lonely wealth had made him. He made her feel like she was rescuing him from something. Years later, she would realize he had simply wanted someone willing to bleed quietly for him. Lillian. She blinked, dragged back into the present. Kurt stood near the kitchen doorway, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored navy suit. Even now, despite everything unraveling between them, he was devastatingly handsome. Tall, broad shoulders, dark blonde hair always perfectly styled. The kind of man people trusted instantly, which made his betrayals even more dangerous. "You okay?" he asked distractedly while checking his phone. not looking at her. Not really. I'm fine. You remembered tonight's dinner, right? She stared at him for a second. Your mother reminded me 3 times. Good. He slipped his phone into his pocket. Investors are flying in from New York. This dinner matters. Everything mattered to the Whitmores except the people around them. Lillian forced a small smile. I know. Kurt kissed her cheek quickly before leaving the kitchen. It felt mechanical, habitual, like something he did because he no longer remembered how not to. The front door shut behind him, and silence flooded the room. Lillian looked down at the lilies again, then slowly pulled her phone from her pocket. No messages from Kurt, no warmth, no affection. Nothing except a calendar reminder for the dinner that evening. Sometimes loneliness inside marriage felt more humiliating than being alone entirely. That afternoon, Lillian sat in the sunroom, reviewing old financial files for Whitmore Holdings. She still handled occasional internal paperwork, unofficially, despite no longer being listed as an employee, because whenever disaster struck, the family quietly turned to her competence, then conveniently forgot her contribution afterward. The merger currently underway was the biggest deal in company history. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Luxury high-rise developments in Miami and Manhattan. Everyone in the house was tense because of it, especially Harrison Whitmore. Kurt's father rarely raised his voice, which somehow made him more intimidating. He carried himself like a man who viewed emotions as inefficiencies. As Lillian reviewed a stack of compliance reports, Harrison entered the sunroom. You caught the discrepancy before legal, Diddy said, without greeting. Lillian looked up. There were errors in the offshore disclosures. That was all he said. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just expectation. Because in the Whitmore family, Lillian's intelligence was useful but never celebrated. Harrison adjusted his watch. You'll attend tonight? Yes. Wear the emerald dress? Investors respond well to elegance. Not you. Elegance. Presentation. Optics. Lillian swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. I'll be there. After he left, her gaze drifted toward the old file boxes stacked near the bookshelf. One box had a faded label from nearly 5 years earlier. Emergency Asset Restructuring. The year Whitmore Holdings nearly collapsed. The memory sent a strange chill through her. That year had been chaos. Federal investigations, liquidity problems, lawsuits, Kurt drinking too much, Valeria screaming at staff, Harrison disappearing into closed-door meetings with attorneys, and Lillian working 70-hour weeks to help untangle legal disasters she was never properly credited for fixing. Her fingers brushed the dusty box absent-mindedly. For a brief second, something tugged at her memory. Documents, urgent signatures, a conference room at 2 a.m, a lawyer telling her, we just need temporary authorization until the restructuring clears. At the time, she had signed whatever they placed in front of her, because Kurt had looked terrified, because she loved him, because she trusted him. Now, years later, unease curled slowly in her stomach. That evening, the Whitmore mansion transformed into a glittering performance of wealth. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, politicians, executives, women in couture gowns, men discussing billion-dollar acquisitions beside the fireplace. Lillian descended the staircase, wearing the emerald silk dress Harrison requested. Conversations paused briefly. Heads turned. Even after years of being diminished, she still carried herself with quiet elegance that couldn't be purchased. But Valeria's eyes narrowed immediately. There you are, she said coolly. I was beginning to worry you'd wear something tragic. Lillian smiled faintly. Good evening to you too? Valeria leaned closer. You know Kurt deserves a woman who naturally fits this world. The words were soft, precise, cruel. Lillian felt the familiar sting in her chest. Across the room, Kurt laughed at something a stunning brunette woman whispered into his ear. The woman touched his arm comfortably. Too comfortably. Lillian watched Kurt smile at her in a way he hadn't smiled at his wife in years. Then the brunette looked directly at Lillian. and smirked. Something cold moved through her body, a feeling she couldn't explain yet, but instinctively feared. The brunette's name was Vanessa Cole. Lillian learned that less than 10 minutes later, when Harrison Whitmore tapped a spoon against his champagne glass and announced her to the room like she was another strategic acquisition. Before dinner begins, Harrison said smoothly, "I'd like everyone to welcome the newest senior legal advisor for Whitmore Holdings, Vanessa Cole." Polite applause filled the dining room. Vanessa smiled with practiced elegance. She wore a fitted black satin dress that looked understated until someone noticed it was designer couture. Everything about her felt calculated. Her posture, her voice, even the way she laughed softly at Kurt's side. Lillian stood near the back of the room, holding a champagne flute she no longer wanted. And of course, Harrison continued, Vanessa has already become invaluable during merger negotiations. Vanessa touched Kurt's arm again. Tiny gesture, tiny movement. But Lillian noticed Kurt didn't pull away. Not even slightly. Instead, he leaned toward Vanessa instinctively, like his body already recognized her comfort. That hurt more than anything. Not passion, not scandal. Familiarity. The kind built slowly over time. The kind that meant this wasn't new. Lillian forced herself to remain calm as dinner guests moved toward the long candlelit table overlooking the indoor garden atrium. The Whitmores loved theatrical dining spaces. Tonight's table looked like something from a magazine, spread white orchids cascading down the center, gold-rimmed crystal glasses, handwritten place cards. And somehow, despite being Kurt's wife, Lillian noticed her seat had been moved farther down the table, away from Kurt, away from the center, closer to the investors' wives and socialites, like she was already being phased out. Valeria noticed her glance. "Oh, don't pout," she said quietly, while adjusting her diamond bracelet. "Seating arrangements are strategic." Lillian sat down slowly. Of course they are. Across the table, Vanessa took the seat beside Kurt, naturally smoothly, like everyone had silently agreed it belonged to her. The humiliation was so subtle, most people wouldn't have noticed. But Lillian did. Every single detail. Dinner began with lobster ravioli and conversations about luxury developments in Miami. Investors praised Whitmore Holdings, while Harrison soaked in admiration. Meanwhile, Lillian barely touched her food. She kept noticing things. Vanessa, finishing Kurt's sentences. Kurt pouring Vanessa wine without asking. Their private smiles. The occasional touch beneath the table they clearly thought nobody could see. Each moment felt like another crack splintering through Lillian's chest. And the worst part, nobody looked uncomfortable. Nobody looked shocked. Which meant they already knew. Valeria dabbed her lips delicately with a napkin. "Vanessa has been absolutely extraordinary," she announced to the table. "Some women simply understand ambition." The comment was directed like a knife. Several guests exchanged awkward glances. Lillian smiled tightly. "I'm sure she appreciates the endorsement." "Oh, she deserves it," Valeria replied. "It's refreshing to see a woman who contributes to the company instead of merely benefiting from it." Silence. Heavy. Sharp. Kurt finally looked up. "Mom," but he stopped, because confronting Valeria would require courage he no longer possessed. Lillian stared at her husband. Just one sentence, one defense. That was all it would have taken. Instead, he lowered his gaze to his wine glass and said nothing. The betrayal settled over her slowly, like snow freezing everything underneath it. Across the table, Vanessa pretended to look uncomfortable. Pretended. Lillian could see it clearly now. The carefully rehearsed innocence. The strategic softness. Vanessa wasn't embarrassed. She was winning. One of the investors tried awkwardly changing the subject. "So Lillian," he asked kindly, "are you still working in compliance law?" Before she could answer, Valeria laughed lightly. "Oh, Lillian doesn't really work anymore." The room chuckled politely. Lillian felt heat rise behind her eyes, not because the comment was devastating, because it was partially true. She had given up her career for this family, And now they were using her sacrifice as evidence she lacked value. That must be nice, Vanessa added sweetly, having the luxury not to work. There it was, the final insult disguised as admiration. Lillian placed her fork down carefully. For years, she would have swallowed the humiliation quietly. Tonight, something inside her felt dangerously close to snapping. I used to work, she said calmly, until I started cleaning up Whitmore Holdings' legal disasters for free. The room froze. Kurt's jaw tightened instantly. Valeria's smile disappeared. Vanessa blinked. Harrison leaned back slowly in his chair. Lillian kept her voice even. You'd be surprised how many crises disappear when someone competent handles them before federal regulators notice. Nobody spoke. Some investors suddenly looked very interested in their wine. Kurt leaned closer to her. Lillian, he muttered warningly, but she was done shrinking herself to protect everyone else's comfort. Valeria recovered first. Well, she said icily, that was unnecessarily dramatic. Lillian smiled faintly. Was it? The tension became unbearable after that. Conversations resumed eventually, but the warmth in the room never fully returned. Kurt barely looked at her. Vanessa avoided eye contact entirely. And for the first time in years, Lillian realized something terrifying. She was no longer afraid of disappointing them. After dinner, guests migrated toward the outdoor terrace overlooking the illuminated pool. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Waiters carried trays of expensive whiskey and miniature desserts. Lillian stood alone near the balcony railing, trying to steady her breathing. The cold night air helped. Barely. You embarrassed Kurt tonight? Valeria's voice appeared behind her, like poison wrapped in silk. Lillian didn't turn around immediately. Interesting, she replied softly. I thought Kurt embarrassed himself. Valeria stepped beside her. Up close, her beauty looked severe. Sharp cheekbones, perfect blonde hair, eyes completely devoid of warmth. You need to understand something, Valeria said quietly. Families like ours survive because we make difficult choices. Lillian finally looked at her. And what exactly am? Valeria's expression didn't change. A mistake Kurt made when he was younger. The words hit harder than Lillian expected, because part of her had always feared they were true. Valeria continued. You were acceptable when the company was unstable. Kurt needed someone obedient, supportive, grateful. Her lips curved slightly. But people evolve. Lillian felt her stomach twist violently. So this is about Vanessa. This is about compatibility. No, Lillian said coldly. This is about replacing me with someone you can parade around at fundraisers. Valeria's silence confirmed it. A sudden laugh echoed nearby. Kurt's laugh. Lillian glanced across the terrace. Vanessa stood beside him near the fire pit. Kurt leaned down to whisper something in her ear, and Vanessa touched his chest while smiling up at him intimately. Not even hiding it anymore. Not even trying. Something inside Lillian cracked completely then. Not loudly, quietly, like glass splintering underwater. Valeria followed her gaze. You should preserve what dignity you still have, she said softly. Then she walked away. Lillian stood frozen beside the railing as humiliation burned through her body. 7 years. 7 years of loyalty, sacrifice, defending Kurt, supporting his dreams, protecting his family, and somehow she had still become disposable. Her phone vibrated suddenly in her clutch purse. A message notification from Kurt. For one pathetic second, hope flared inside her chest. Maybe he finally realized how cruel tonight had become. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe. Lillian opened the message, but it wasn't meant for her. It had been accidentally forwarded from another thread. A message from Vanessa. Last night was worth every risk. I'm tired of pretending in front of her. Lillian stopped breathing. Below the message sat Kurt's reply. Just a little longer. Everything changes after the merger. The world around her blurred. The music, the laughter, the glittering lights reflected across the pool. All of it suddenly felt grotesque, like she had been living inside a beautiful lie, and everyone except her knew it. Lillian didn't cry that night. That frightened her more than anything. She sat alone in the dark guest bedroom beside Kurt's master suite, the bedroom he had slowly stopped sharing with her months ago, and stared at the glowing screen of her phone until sunrise painted pale gold across the walls. Just a little longer. Everything changes after the merger. She reread the message at least 50 times. Not because she didn't understand it, because she finally did. The merger mattered more than their marriage, more than loyalty, more than 7 years of loving him. Lillian used to think betrayal arrived dramatically. Screaming matches, lipstick stains, explosive confessions. But real betrayal was quieter. It was realizing your husband had emotionally left you long before he physically replaced you. At 6:12 a.m., the bedroom door opened. Kurt walked in looking exhausted, already dressed for work. His tie hung loose around his neck, and he smelled faintly of whiskey and expensive cologne. He stopped when he saw her awake. "You're up early?" Lillian studied him silently. For years, she had loved this man so deeply, she built entire versions of reality around protecting him from consequences. Now she looked at him and saw something unfamiliar. Cowardice. "You slept with her." The words landed flatly between them. Kurt froze. Just for a second. Then came the denial she already expected. "Lillian, no." Her voice stayed calm. Too calm. "Don't insult me by lying first." Kurt rubbed a hand over his face. "It's complicated." A bitter laugh escaped her throat. That sentence. Every cheating man in history probably believed he invented it. "You told her everything changes after the merger." His expression shifted instantly. Not guilt, panic. "You went through my phone?" "There it is," Lillian whispered. "That's what you care about." Kurt exhaled sharply. "Lower your voice." She stared at him in disbelief. "You're worried someone might hear me." "You're emotional right now." That sentence almost destroyed something inside her. Not the affair, not even the humiliation, the dismissal, the immediate attempt to reduce her pain into irrational female instability. Lillian stood slowly. "I gave up my career for you." Kurt looked away. "I defended you to your family for years." "Lillian, I protected this company during federal investigations while your mother treated me like hired help. That's not fair." "No." Her eyes burned now. "Tell me one thing your family has ever done that was fair to me." Silence. That was the problem with selfish people. Eventually, they ran out of explanations and only had entitlement left. Kurt loosened his tie impatiently. "You're acting like this came out of nowhere." The words hit her like ice water. "You're blaming me." "I'm saying we haven't been happy for a long time. Because you stopped trying." "No," Kurt snapped suddenly. "Because everything became heavy with you. Every conversation, every day. You stopped being supportive." Lillian stared at him. Supportive. The word echoed in her head like something grotesque. Supportive meant shrinking herself while he betrayed her. Supportive meant staying quiet while his mother humiliated her publicly. Supportive meant sacrificing everything and asking for nothing. "I stopped worshiping you," she said softly. "That's what really changed." Kurt's jaw tightened. "You always make yourself the victim." Lillian almost laughed again. It was incredible how cruel people became once they no longer needed your devotion. She stepped closer slowly. "Did you love her before or after you started touching her in front of me?" Kurt's face darkened. "It wasn't planned. Neither was my entire life collapsing overnight." For the first time, guilt flickered across his expression. Tiny, weak, nowhere near enough. Kurt sat heavily at the edge of the bed. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under right now." And there it was, the Whitmore philosophy. No matter what damage they caused, their stress always mattered more than everyone else's suffering. Lillian folded her arms tightly across herself. "Does your mother know?" Kurt hesitated too long. Her stomach dropped. "Oh my God. It's not like that." "She knows." She suspected. Lillian felt physically sick. The dinner suddenly made horrifying sense. The seating arrangement, the insults, Vanessa sitting beside Kurt openly. They weren't hiding the affair. They were slowly transitioning her out of the family, like replacing outdated furniture. How long? Lillian asked quietly. Kurt looked down. 6 months. The room tilted. 6 months. 6 months of lying to her face. 6 months of sleeping beside another woman while allowing Lillian to keep sacrificing herself for him. You brought her into this house. It wasn't serious at first. Lillian flinched like he slapped her. Not serious, as if betrayal became less monstrous, depending on emotional depth. Kurt stood again. We didn't mean for this to happen. You mean you didn't mean for me to find out before the merger? His silence confirmed everything. Lillian suddenly remembered Vanessa's words from dinner. Having the luxury not to work, not mockery, testing territory, dominance. The realization hit her hard and fast. Vanessa didn't just want Kurt, she wanted Lillian erased. Kurt moved toward her carefully. We can handle this privately. Lillian looked at him with genuine disbelief. You think this is salvageable? I think marriages go through difficult periods. No, she whispered. Marriages go through difficulties. Affairs are choices. Kurt's frustration finally surfaced. So what now? You want some dramatic divorce? Public humiliation? Is that what this is? The irony nearly choked her. Public humiliation. As if he hadn't already orchestrated exactly that. I want honesty, she said. For once, Kurt ran both hands through his hair. You're not making this easier. Lillian stared at him for a long moment, then quietly asked the question, destroying her from the inside. Did you ever feel guilty when I touched you? That finally broke something in his expression, because there was no good answer, and they both knew it. He looked away first. That was answer enough. Hours later, after Kurt left for work, Lillian wandered through the mansion like a ghost haunting her own marriage. Staff avoided eye contact. Some already knew. Maybe all of them did. Humiliation clung to her skin everywhere she walked. Around noon, she entered Harrison's private office, searching for old merger paperwork. She wasn't even entirely sure why. Instinct, maybe. Or survival. The office smelled like leather and cedar wood. Massive windows overlooked the estate gardens, while shelves filled with legal binders lined the walls. Lillian moved quietly through stacks of documents until voices approached from the hallway. She froze. Valeria and Harrison. She's becoming unstable, Valeria was saying coldly. Harrison sounded irritated. We just need this merger finalized. And then a pause. Then Valeria answered calmly. Then Kurt files for divorce. Vanessa transitions in publicly, cleanly. Lillian stopped breathing. Harrison sighed heavily. What about the old restructuring paperwork? Another silence. Longer this time. Then Valeria said something that sent chills racing down Lillian's spine. Once she signs everything, she's disposable. Disposable? Not heartbroken, not betrayed, disposable. Like an object that had outlived usefulness. Lillian backed away from the office door, slowly pulse roaring in her ears. Old restructuring paperwork. What paperwork? Why did it matter so much? And why did fear suddenly crawl through her body every time they mentioned documents from 5 years ago? For the first time since discovering the affair, Lillian's grief momentarily gave way to something sharper. Suspicion. Because deep down instinct whispered something terrifying. The Whitmores weren't just hiding an affair. They were hiding something far bigger. Lillian barely slept for the next 2 nights. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Valeria's voice again. Once she signs everything, she's disposable. The sentence kept replaying in her mind like a warning siren. Not because it hurt emotionally anymore. Because it sounded strategic, calculated, dangerous. By Thursday morning, grief had transformed into something colder, sharper, awareness. For years, Lillian ignored her instincts to preserve peace inside the marriage. Every red flag had been explained away, every moment of disrespect softened into excuses. Kurt is stressed. Valeria doesn't mean it personally. The company is under pressure. But now she started seeing patterns instead of incidents, and patterns told stories. The mansion was unusually quiet that afternoon. Harrison and Kurt were in Manhattan meeting investors while Valeria attended a charity luncheon downtown with Vanessa practically attached to her side. Lillian noticed that too. Vanessa wasn't being hidden anymore. She was being introduced, positioned, like a successor. The realization should have devastated her. Instead, it made her strangely calm, because once illusion died, clarity became easier. Lillian carried a mug of untouched coffee into the upstairs study, where old company archives were stored. The room smelled faintly of dust and leather binding glue. Tall shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with years of Whitmore Holdings paperwork. She locked the door behind her, then began searching. At first, she wasn't even entirely sure what she was looking for. Just something. Anything connected to the restructuring crisis 5 years earlier. The year Whitmore Holdings almost collapsed. The year Kurt cried in her arms at 3 in the morning, whispering, "If this company goes under, my father will never recover." Back then, she had done everything possible to save them. Long nights reviewing compliance violations, emergency negotiations with federal attorneys, financial disclosure corrections. Lillian remembered sitting inside conference rooms until sunrise, while executives twice her age panicked around her. And somehow, despite not officially being a Whitmore executive, everyone listened when she spoke. Because she was good at this? No. Better than good. Exceptional. She had forgotten that about herself. The realization hurt unexpectedly. Lillian opened another file drawer, then another. Most contained boring financial records, acquisition drafts, or tax disclosures, until finally, emergency asset restructuring. The faded black lettering sent a chill through her. She pulled the thick binder free slowly. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. Her pulse began rising immediately. Inside sat dozens of documents stamped confidential across the top. Emergency trust transfers, temporary holding agreements, offshore restructuring drafts, legal chaos. Lillian flipped carefully through page after page, then stopped abruptly. Her own signature stared back at her. Dated 5 years earlier, her chest tightened. She remembered that night now, barely. The legal team had been scrambling after federal regulators, froze several Whitmore assets during investigation threats. Harrison had gathered everyone in a conference room around 2 in the morning. People shouting, phones ringing nonstop, lawyers panicking, and Kurt had looked terrified. One of the attorneys had slid papers toward her. "We need temporary authorization signatures to protect core properties until litigation settles." At the time, Lillian hadn't questioned it. She trusted them, trusted Kurt, trusted the family she nearly killed herself trying to save. Her fingers trembled slightly as she continued reading. Then suddenly, she froze. The room went completely silent around her. No, no, that couldn't be right. Lillian leaned closer to the page. The document wasn't just temporary authorization paperwork, it was a strategic trust protection agreement. And buried deep inside the legal language sat one explosive clause. Primary authorization rights remain contingent upon consent of acting fiduciary signatory Lillian Hicks. Her heartbeat thundered violently. She reread the sentence 3 times, then 5, then again. The implications crashed into her slowly. During the restructuring crisis, several luxury commercial properties had been transferred into a protected trust structure to shield them from seizure during federal review. Those properties now represented nearly 40% of Whitmore Holdings' merger valuation. And according to this document, nothing involving those assets could legally proceed without her authorization. Lillian sat back slowly in the chair. Oh my God. Her voice barely came out above a whisper. The merger. That was why they suddenly wanted her cooperative. That was why Valeria kept mentioning signatures. That was why nobody pushed for divorce publicly yet. Because despite all their money and power, they still needed her. A laugh almost escaped her throat. Not from amusement, from disbelief. For years, they treated her like decoration. And all this time, legally, she had been holding the keys to part of their empire without even knowing it. Her mind raced rapidly now. Did Kurt know? Did Harris and Valeria clearly knew enough to be nervous? But how much had they hidden from her intentionally? And then another horrifying possibility surfaced. Had the entire marriage stayed intact this long, because leaving her earlier would have threatened company control? Lillian suddenly felt sick. Every anniversary, every forced smile, every "we'll work through this." What if none of it had been real anymore? What if she had simply remained useful? Tears burned behind her eyes, but she forced them back down. No, not now. She needed clarity more than emotion. Lillian pulled out her phone and began photographing every page carefully. Trust agreements, signature pages, asset schedules, amendments. She uploaded copies into a secure, encrypted drive she still maintained from her compliance days. By the time she finished, dusk had fallen outside. The room glowed amber beneath antique wall sconces. And for the first time in years, Lillian felt something unfamiliar inside herself. Power. Not emotional power. Legal power. The kind the Whitmores actually respected. A sudden knock hit the study door. Lillian nearly jumped. Lillian Kurt. Her pulse spiked instantly. She shoved the original document back into the binder, just as the doorknob rattled lightly. "You locked the door?" His voice sounded distracted. Careful. Lillian took one steadying breath before opening it. Kurt stood there loosening his tie, exhaustion visible beneath his polished appearance. Then his eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the open files. Something unreadable crossed his face. "What are you doing?" Lillian kept her tone neutral. "Cleaning." His gaze narrowed slightly. "At 7 at night," she shrugged. "I couldn't sleep." Kurt stepped inside slowly. The tension between them had become unbearable since the affair confrontation. Every conversation now felt like walking through broken glass barefoot. His eyes landed on the restructuring binder instantly, and for the briefest moment, fear flickered across his expression. Tiny, but unmistakable. Lillian noticed immediately. So did he, which meant he realized she noticed. "What's that?" he asked, too casually. The question confirmed everything. He knew the documents mattered. Maybe not fully, but enough to panic. Lillian closed the binder gently. Old restructuring records. Kurt walked closer. Too close. "Why are you looking through those?" There it was again. Not curiosity. Anxiety. Lillian met his eyes steadily. "You tell me." A long silence stretched between them. She watched calculations happening behind his gaze. Kurt smiled finally, but it looked strained. "You've always had a habit of digging into things that don't concern you." The sentence hit differently now. Not dismissive, defensive. Lillian folded her arms slowly. "I think my marriage concerns me." Kurt exhaled sharply. "This again?" "No," she said quietly. "Not this again?" This for the first time. Something cold moved across his face. "You're being dramatic." Lillian almost laughed. Every manipulative person eventually called accountability drama. She stepped toward him carefully. "What exactly am I supposed to sign, Kurt?" His expression changed instantly. There it was. Panic. Real panic this time. And suddenly, Lillian understood something terrifying. Whatever this document truly meant, the Whitmores were far more afraid of losing her than they ever let her see. Kurt recovered too quickly. That was the first thing Lillian noticed. The panic flashing across his face vanished almost instantly, buried beneath the polished calm the Whitmores had perfected over generations. He loosened his tie slowly and gave her a tired smile. "You're exhausted," he said gently. You've barely slept in days. There it was. Deflection. Not denial, not explanation, manipulation. Lillian held his gaze. What am I supposed to sign? Kurt moved toward the liquor cabinet in the study, like he needed physical distance from the question. The merger paperwork is complicated. That's not an answer. He poured himself whiskey. Didn't offer her any. That tiny detail hurt more than it should have. Once upon a time, Kurt knew exactly how she liked her drinks. Extra lemon in tea, no sugar in coffee, bourbon only when she was overwhelmed. Now he looked at her like she was another problem waiting to become expensive. You're spiraling, he said quietly. Lillian almost smiled. It fascinated her how often cruel men called women emotional the moment women started noticing patterns. I read the trust agreement. The glass froze halfway to Kurt's lips. A beat of silence. Then you shouldn't have gone through confidential company files. Not outrage. Fear. Again. Lillian felt it deep in her bones now. This mattered. You used me, she whispered. Kurt slammed the glass down harder than intended. That's not fair. Really? Her voice cracked slightly for the first time. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your family kept me around until I became inconvenient. You have no idea how much pressure we're under. There it is again. Lillian shook her head slowly. Every horrible thing you do becomes acceptable because you're stressed. Kurt looked exhausted suddenly. Older. Less charming. For years she thought his vulnerability made him gentle. Now she realized the weakness and kindness were not the same thing. We were going to explain everything after the merger. Lillian laughed bitterly. No. You were going to divorce me after the merger. His silence confirmed it. The room felt suffocating. All those years she spent defending him to herself collapsed at once. The late nights, the emotional distance, the way he stopped touching her, stopped looking at her. He hadn't been confused. He'd already left. Emotionally, mentally, morally. He just needed her signature first. Lillian stepped back slowly. I can't even recognize you anymore. Something flashed across Kurt's face then. Not remorse. Annoyance? Because her pain was becoming inconvenient? You're acting like I'm some monster. You let your mistress humiliate me in public. It wasn't like that. She sat beside you at dinner. Vanessa understands the business. The sentence slipped out too naturally. Too honestly. Lillian stared at him in disbelief. And suddenly, everything became painfully clear. Vanessa wasn't simply an affair. She represented the version of life Kurt wanted now. Ambitious, polished, strategic. A woman Valeria approved of, someone who fit the image. Meanwhile, Lillian had become associated with sacrifice, emotional labor, complicated history. The years Whitmore Holdings struggled, she reminded them of survival. Vanessa reminded them of success. The realization cut deeper than she expected. Kurt sighed heavily. You're making this uglier than it needs to be. Lillian looked at him for a long moment, then quietly asked, when exactly were you planning to tell me my marriage was over? Kurt looked away. That's not fair. No, she whispered. What you did wasn't fair. He finished the whiskey in one swallow. We both know this relationship hasn't worked for a long time. Lillian flinched. Not because of the words, because part of her hated how desperately she still wanted him to fight for them anyway. Love was humiliating like that sometimes. Even after betrayal, some wounded part of the heart kept begging, please choose me. But Kurt already had, and it wasn't her. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted dramatically. Something had changed. Lillian felt it immediately. Staff avoided her eyes entirely now. Valeria's assistant stopped speaking when she entered rooms. Conversations ended abruptly around her. They knew, not just about the affair, about the documents, about her discovering something she wasn't supposed to understand. By noon, Valeria requested a private family discussion in the formal sitting room, which really meant an ambush. Lillian entered the room wearing cream trousers and a fitted black sweater, her posture calm, despite the anxiety clawing through her chest. Valeria sat elegantly beside the fireplace. Harrison stood near the window. Kurt leaned against the bar cart, looking exhausted. And Vanessa was there too, sitting comfortably in the room like she already belonged. The disrespect of it nearly stole Lillian's breath. Valeria folded her hands delicately. Lillian, she began smoothly, we need to discuss moving forward maturely. Maturely. Interesting word choice for people destroying her life. Lillian stayed standing. Then let's stop pretending. Valeria's expression hardened slightly. This hostility is unnecessary. You brought your son's mistress into a family meeting? Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, though not nearly uncomfortable enough. Kurt rubbed his forehead. Can we please not do this right now? Lillian looked at him coldly. When exactly would be convenient for you? Harrison stepped forward finally. The merger closes in 11 days. There it was. Straight to business. Always. Lillian crossed her arms. And we need your cooperation. Not apology, not accountability. Cooperation. The words settled inside her like acid. Valeria leaned forward slightly. You signed temporary fiduciary authorizations during the restructuring years ago. Legal needs updated approval signatures. Lillian's pulse spiked. So it's true. Kurt stepped in quickly. It's procedural. No, she snapped suddenly. An affair is procedural to you? This is leverage. Silence crashed through the room. For the first time since this nightmare began, nobody attempted to gaslight her. Because they couldn't anymore. She knew too much. Valeria's mask slipped slightly. You are overestimating your importance. Lillian almost laughed. If that were true, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That landed. Hard. Harrison's jaw tightened. We protected you financially for years. The audacity of that statement nearly stunned her. Protected me, Lillian repeated softly. I built compliance strategies that saved your company from federal seizure. Valeria stood abruptly. And we gave you a life you never could have had otherwise. There it was, the real Whitmore philosophy. Everything they gave came with ownership attached. Love, money, marriage. Nothing was unconditional. Lillian looked around the room slowly. At Kurt, at Vanessa, at the people who had spent years making her feel small. And suddenly she felt exhausted. Not weak. Just done. I'm not signing anything today. Kurt pushed away from the bar cart instantly. Lillian, no. She held up a hand. You lost the right to pressure me the moment you started sleeping with someone else in our home. Vanessa finally spoke, quietly. We didn't mean to hurt you. Lillian turned toward her slowly. The sheer arrogance of sympathy from the woman helping dismantle her marriage almost made her laugh. You know what's interesting, Lillian said softly. You keep acting like you won. Vanessa's expression faltered. Excuse me, you inherited a man who betrays women that love him. The room went dead silent. Kurt's face darkened instantly. That's enough. No, Lillian whispered. I think I'm finally saying enough. She turned toward the door. Then Valeria delivered the final blow. Cold. Precise. If you refuse cooperation, she said calmly, you'll leave this family with nothing. Lillian stopped walking, slowly turned around. Valeria continued, no house, no accounts, no transportation. The lawyers already prepared separation terms. Everything had already been arranged, every detail. They hadn't been trying to save the marriage. They'd been preparing her removal, like terminating an employee. Kurt looked guilty now, but not guilty enough to stop it. Never guilty enough. Lillian stared at the people in front of her and realized something devastating. None of them believed she could survive without them. And maybe that had been the Whitmores' greatest mistake. Because the moment someone stops fearing your power, they become dangerous. They threw her out 3 days later. Not dramatically, not loudly. That would have required emotional honesty. The Whitmores preferred cruelty wrapped in professionalism. Lillian returned from a morning walk to find two black security SUVs parked outside the mansion. Her stomach tightened instantly. Something was wrong. The front doors stood open. Inside, movers carried labeled storage bins through the marble foyer, while Valeria supervised calmly with a clipboard in hand. For one disoriented second, Lillian thought maybe the family was preparing for renovations. Then she saw her framed wedding photo sitting inside a cardboard box beside the staircase. Her breath caught painfully. Kurt. Her voice echoed through the foyer. No answer. Valeria glanced up coolly. You're back earlier than expected. Lillian looked around slowly. What is this? The separation process. The words landed with surgical precision. Not divorce, not heartbreak. Process. Two movers brushed past carrying boxes from upstairs. Lillian recognized her belongings immediately. Books, shoes, clothes, 7 years of marriage being packed like inventory. You're packing my things? Valeria continued writing on the clipboard. The attorneys advised efficiency. Lillian laughed once in disbelief. Small, broken. You couldn't even wait until I was emotionally prepared. Valeria finally looked at her. My dear, emotionally prepared women are usually the ones with leverage. You no longer have any. The statement was meant to crush her. Instead, rage began building quietly beneath her skin. Where's Kurt in Manhattan? Of course he was. Cowardice always found scheduling conflicts. Lillian moved toward the staircase immediately, but one of the security guards stepped subtly into her path. Not touching her, just blocking. Humiliating her without visible aggression. Her eyes widened slowly. You have security escorting me in my own house. Valeria's expression remained composed. It's the Whitmore residence, not your house. That part remained unspoken. Lillian stared at her mother-in-law and suddenly realized something chilling. Valeria had been waiting for this moment for years. Every criticism, every humiliation, every reminder that Lillian didn't belong. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This was a woman finally removing someone she always considered temporary. I need my laptop, Lillian said tightly. It's already packed. Panic flashed through her chest instantly. The documents. Her encrypted copies were secure online, but the original trust agreement was still hidden inside the padded sleeve compartment of her laptop case upstairs. If they found it, everything changed. Valeria tilted her head slightly. Actually, before you leave, our attorneys requested a quick review of personal belongings. Lillian went completely still. There it was. Fear moved coldly through her body. Not because they knew exactly what she had, because they suspected enough to search. A younger assistant approached, carrying a tablet. Mrs. Hicks, she said awkwardly, we just need confirmation. No confidential corporate materials are being removed from the property. Mrs. Hicks. Not Lillian. Not family. Already erased. Lillian forced calm into her voice. You're searching my belongings, standard procedure, Valeria answered smoothly. No, Lillian whispered. This is intimidation. Valeria smiled faintly. Call it whatever helps you sleep tonight. Two guards escorted Lillian upstairs, while movers continued emptying her life into boxes. The humiliation was almost surreal. Drawers opened, closets stripped bare, jewelry cases inventoried. Even the bedroom looked unfamiliar already, as though the marriage itself was being sanitized from existence. Lillian's pulse hammered violently as she spotted her laptop bag on the bed, still zipped, still untouched. One of the attorneys stepped forward. We'll need access to all electronic devices. Lillian crossed the room immediately. My personal laptop contains private information. Whitmore Holdings correspondence exists on that device because they made her work for free for years. The thought nearly made her sick. She unzipped the bag, slowly praying her hands didn't shake visibly. The original document remained hidden beneath the padded inner lining, exactly where she placed it. Thank God. The attorney reached for the laptop. Lillian stopped him. You can review files in front of me. His jaw tightened. Clearly not the answer he wanted. For 20 unbearable minutes, they searched through emails, folders, downloaded reports. Lillian sat frozen beside them, forcing herself to breathe normally, while inches away sat the one document capable of destroying the Whitmore's merger. At one point, the attorney frowned. There's an encrypted drive here. Personal records. We'll need the password. No. Valeria stepped into the doorway behind them. Excuse me? Lillian looked directly at her. You don't get unlimited access to my private accounts because your son cheated. The silence thickened instantly. Valeria's eyes hardened. You are in no position to make demands, and you're in no position to violate federal privacy laws. That landed hard. Because, unlike the Whitmores, Lillian actually understood legal exposure. The attorney cleared his throat carefully. She's technically correct. Valeria looked furious. Good. For the first time in years, Lillian wanted her angry. The attorney eventually closed the laptop. We're done. Relief nearly buckled Lillian's knees. They didn't find it. They had searched her life while missing the single thing that mattered most. The irony almost felt poetic. An hour later, rain began falling outside as movers loaded the final boxes into a black sedan. Kurt still hadn't come home, not even to watch her leave. That hurt more than she expected. Some pathetic, wounded part of her kept hoping he'd appear at the last second and stop this madness. Fight for her. Choose her. But deep down, she already knew men like Kurt only fought for things once. Losing them became expensive. Valeria stood beneath the covered front entrance, watching silently as Lillian carried her final suitcase down the steps. You should have accepted the settlement quietly, she said. Lillian paused. What settlement? Valeria's lips curved slightly. The one Kurt planned to offer after the merger. The words crashed into her. After. Everything always circled back to after the merger. Lillian tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. You treated me like a placeholder. Valeria didn't deny it. In marriages like yours, usefulness matters more than romance. God. The coldness of that statement. Lillian looked toward the mansion one last time. 7 years, birthdays, Christmas mornings, late-night laughter in the kitchen, crying in Kurt's arms after her father died. Had any of it been real, or had she simply loved harder than everyone around her? Valeria stepped closer quietly. You should understand something, Lillian. Women like you survive by attaching yourselves to families like ours. Women like you. The phrase sliced deeper than intended, because for years, Lillian secretly feared it was true, that without the Whitmores, she became ordinary again, small again, disposable again. But then something unexpected happened. She remembered the documents, the trust agreement, the legal authority they desperately needed. And suddenly, Valeria's words stopped hurting, because powerful people only humiliated others when they believed themselves untouchable. The Whitmores still thought Lillian was powerless. That was their fatal mistake. Lillian lifted her suitcase calmly. I think, she said softly, you've spent so long underestimating me that you forgot to be careful. Valeria frowned slightly. What does that mean? Lillian smiled for the first time in days. Not warmly, not kindly, just knowingly. Then she walked down the rain-soaked steps without another word. The cold air hit her face hard. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go. No husband, no home, no certainty. Only a laptop bag pressed tightly against her chest, and a terrifying realization growing louder in her mind. The Whitmores had just thrown away the one person standing between them and complete destruction. 40 minutes later, Lillian checked into a cheap roadside motel off Interstate 95. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. Nothing about it resembled the luxury life she'd just lost. And strangely, that made breathing easier. No performance, no pretending, No watching herself disappear slowly to keep peace inside a toxic family. Rain tapped softly against the motel window as she finally opened the hidden laptop compartment. The original trust agreement remained there, untouched, real. Lillian stared at the document for a long moment, then slowly reached for her phone. There was only one person she could think of now, one person ruthless enough to survive the Whitmores. She searched through old contacts until she found the number: Grace Monroe, New York corporate litigation attorney. Brilliant, feared, impossible to manipulate. Lillian hesitated only a second before pressing call. The phone rang twice. Then a calm female voice answered, Grace Monroe speaking. Lillian swallowed hard. "My name is Lillian Hicks," she whispered, "and I think my husband's family committed fraud." Grace Monroe did not sound surprised. That unsettled Lillian immediately. The attorney listened silently for nearly 15 minutes while rain battered the motel windows and trucks roared past outside on the interstate. Lillian explained everything: the affair, the merger, the trust agreement, the sudden pressure for signatures, the way the Whitmores had removed her from the house like a legal inconvenience. Grace interrupted only once. "Do you still possess the original documents?" "Yes," Good Grace said calmly. "Because if what you're describing is accurate, they are in serious trouble. Not emotional trouble, not marital trouble, legal trouble." The distinction mattered. Lillian sat curled against the motel headboard, still wearing yesterday's sweater. Exhaustion weighed on her bones so heavily, she almost couldn't process the conversation. "I don't understand any of this anymore." Grace's voice sharpened slightly. "Then let me simplify it." Paper rustled on the other end of the line. "You said the trust was created during federal restructuring exposure 5 years ago?" "Yes. And your fiduciary authorization remained active." "I think so?" "No." Grace paused. "Not think. We need certainty." Lillian reached for the document beside her. Her hands still trembled slightly as she reread the language. It says, "Authorization rights remain contingent upon consent of acting fiduciary signatory." Grace went silent, long enough to make Lillian nervous. Then finally, "Jesus Christ." Lillian swallowed hard. "What Lillian? They didn't just keep you uninformed." Grace's voice lowered carefully. "They appear to have intentionally concealed your legal control position while benefiting from your authority." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What does that mean?" "It means the merger may be impossible without you." The words crashed through her body. For years, the Whitmores made her feel powerless, replaceable, financially dependent, emotionally weak, and now suddenly, one of New York's most feared litigation attorneys was telling her she held leverage powerful enough to destabilize a corporate merger worth hundreds of millions. The emotional whiplash nearly made her dizzy. Grace continued, "You need to leave that motel immediately." Lillian blinked. "What? If they realize you understand the documents, things will escalate quickly." Fear slid coldly through her stomach. "You think they'd come after me? I think wealthy families protect assets aggressively. Not people. Assets." Again, the distinction mattered. Grace arranged for a car service within the hour. By midnight, Lillian sat silently in the back of a black SUV, heading toward Manhattan, while city lights blurred through rain-streaked windows. She hadn't been back to New York professionally in years. The skyline used to excite her. Tonight, it looked sharp enough to cut. Grace Monroe's office occupied the 37th floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking Bryant Park. Even at nearly 1 in the morning, lights still glowed behind several offices. Power never slept in Manhattan, neither did ambition. A receptionist escorted Lillian through a hallway lined with framed legal awards before stopping outside massive walnut doors. "Ms. Monroe will see you now." Lillian entered cautiously. Grace Monroe stood near floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a charcoal suit and impossibly high heels, dark hair pulled into a severe knot at the base of her neck. She looked exactly like the kind of woman who dismantled billion-dollar men for sport. Sharp-eyed, controlled, dangerous. Grace crossed the office immediately and extended a hand. Lillian Hicks. Something about hearing her full name spoken respectfully almost made Lillian emotional. Thank you for seeing me. Grace gestured toward the conference table. Sit. No unnecessary warmth, no fake sympathy. Oddly, Lillian found that comforting. Grace reviewed the documents for nearly 40 straight minutes without speaking much. Occasionally, she highlighted sections or photographed pages with her phone. Lillian watched anxiety deepen across the attorney's face with each page. Finally, Grace leaned back slowly. Well, she said quietly, this is catastrophic. Lillian's throat tightened. For me, Grace looked directly at her. For them. Silence filled the room. Grace tapped one specific clause inside the trust agreement. This restructuring trust controls strategic commercial assets tied directly to the Whitmore merger valuation. I know that part. No, Grace corrected. I don't think you do. She slid another document across the table. The merger is being financed against projected asset control. Without your authorization, several properties become legally inaccessible under fiduciary restrictions. Lillian stared at her blankly. Grace simplified. The merger collapses without you. The words landed differently, hearing them out loud. Real, solid, terrifying. Lillian sat back slowly. They threw me away anyway. Grace's expression sharpened. Because they assumed you didn't understand what you signed. And suddenly, the entire marriage looked horrifying through a new lens. The pressure to stay agreeable, the emotional manipulation, the delayed divorce, even Kurt's panic inside the study. They hadn't just betrayed her emotionally. They'd hidden her own legal significance from her for years. Lillian laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. I spent 7 years thinking I was the least important person in that family. Grace closed the folder carefully. That was intentional. The sentence hit like a physical blow. Intentional. Not accidental neglect. Not emotional distance. Systematic minimization. Lillian looked down at her hands. I loved him. Grace's expression softened slightly for the first time. I know. No, I really loved him. Her voice cracked now. I built my entire life around protecting him. And what did he build around protecting you? The question destroyed her, because there was no answer. Grace stood and walked toward the espresso machine in the corner. Powerful families survive by assigning roles, she said while preparing coffee. The golden child, the enforcer, the sacrifice. Lillian looked up slowly. And me. Grace handed her a cup. You were the stabilizer. The words settled painfully deep. Not loved, needed. Different things entirely. Grace returned to the table. Now listen carefully, because what happens next matters. Lillian straightened instinctively. You cannot contact Kurt emotionally anymore. The statement startled her. What? No emotional conversations. No pleading. No closure meetings. No private negotiations. Lillian stared at her. Grace's voice remained calm and clinical. People like the Whitmores regain control by making women emotional again. And suddenly, Lillian remembered every argument where Kurt called her dramatic. Every moment Valeria reduced her pain into instability. Every time she apologized simply to restore peace. God. Grace was right. You need to understand your position clearly, Grace continued. Legally, you are not weak here. But emotionally, Grace interrupted gently. You're grieving people who never protected you. That silence afterward felt unbearable, because it was true. Grace opened another file. I already had my team pull preliminary merger records. Lillian blinked. That fast Grace gave her a dry look. You called a corporate litigator at midnight and mentioned concealed fiduciary authority inside a billion-dollar merger. This is basically catnip for attorneys. Despite everything, a tiny laugh escaped Lillian. her first real laugh in days. Grace noticed. Good. Keep doing that. You'll need your head clear. The attorney's phone buzzed suddenly. She glanced down, then smiled faintly. Well, that didn't take long. Lillian's stomach tightened. What? Grace turned the screen toward her. Incoming call, Kurt Whitmore. Of course. Panic finally reached him. Grace silenced the call immediately. Then another message appeared seconds later, followed by another and another. Lillian stared at the screen while dread and satisfaction twisted together painfully inside her chest. Kurt knew. Maybe not everything yet, but enough. He's scared, Grace said quietly. Lillian looked away. Part of her hated how much that still hurt, because once upon a time, she would have done anything to protect Kurt from fear. Now she was the reason for it. Grace gathered the documents neatly into a folder. Lillian, she said carefully, I need you to hear me clearly. Lillian nodded slowly. Grace's eyes locked onto hers. They didn't throw out the wife. A pause. Then they threw out the one person keeping them alive. At that exact moment, Lillian's phone lit up again. Kurt calling. Again, again, again. And for the first time since the marriage began falling apart, Lillian let him wait. The Whitmores stopped pretending after that. By Friday morning, Kurt had called 32 times. Valeria sent 2 formal requests through attorneys. Harrison attempted professionalism, emailing Grace Monroe directly with carefully polished language about misunderstandings and mutual cooperation. Nobody mentioned the affair anymore. Interesting. The marriage itself had suddenly become secondary. Now it was about the merger. About money? About survival? Lillian sat inside Grace's conference room overlooking Manhattan, while junior associates rushed around carrying stacks of financial records and merger filings. The energy inside the office felt electric, predatory. Grace's team had spent less than 24 hours investigating Whitmore Holdings and already uncovered inconsistencies, concealed disclosures, altered fiduciary references, missing authorization notices. The deeper they dug, the uglier things became. Grace entered carrying another file. You were intentionally omitted from at least 6 merger-related disclosures. Lillian looked up sharply. That's illegal, isn't it? Grace gave a humorless smile. Very. For a moment, silence settled between them. Lillian still struggled processing the emotional shift happening inside her. 3 days ago, she was crying alone in a mansion, wondering why her husband stopped loving her. Now, elite attorneys were building a corporate fraud case around documents signed in her name. The emotional whiplash felt surreal. Grace sat across from her. They're panicking. Lillian glanced toward Kurt's latest unread text message, glowing on her phone screen. Please call me. We can fix this. Fix this, not fix us. That distinction no longer escaped her. What happens if the merger collapses? Lillian asked quietly. Grace leaned back slightly. Best case scenario, massive financial losses and public embarrassment, and worst case, federal investigation. The words settled heavily into the room. Lillian stared down at her coffee. She never wanted to destroy anyone. That was the irony in all this. The Whitmores spent years treating her like a threat, when she had spent most of the marriage protecting them from consequences. Grace's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, then looked at Lillian carefully. The Whitmores moved up the merger signing ceremony. Lillian frowned. What it was scheduled for next week. Grace slid the tablet toward her. Now it's tonight. A cold sensation moved through Lillian's body. They're trying to close before I can intervene. Exactly. Grace stood immediately. Get your coat. 2 hours later, Lillian stepped into the lobby of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, wearing a cream-colored tailored sweat Grace's assistant purchased for her that morning. The transformation startled even her. No oversized sweaters, no exhausted wife trying to keep peace. She looked sharp, controlled, dangerous. Grace walked beside her in black heels carrying a leather portfolio. You don't speak unless necessary, Grace instructed quietly as elevators opened. Let them expose themselves first. Lillian nodded. Her pulse hammered violently anyway. The ballroom upstairs looked exactly like the kind of place powerful people celebrated themselves. Crystal chandeliers, wall-to-wall windows overlooking Manhattan, executives in designer suits, champagne flowing endlessly. A massive digital screen displayed Whitmore Holdings and Carrington Urban Capital strategic merger event. The moment Kurt saw her, all color drained from his face. Good. For the first time since the affair began unraveling, Lillian wanted him uncomfortable. Valeria recovered first. Of course she did. Her smile appeared elegant and deadly as she approached. Lillian, she said smoothly. What an unexpected surprise. Grace stepped forward before Lillian could answer. Grace Monroe, counsel representing Miss Hicks. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Executives nearby fell silent. Attorneys recognized Grace instantly. Fear flickered behind Harrison's eyes across the room. He knew exactly who she was. Valeria's smile tightened almost invisibly. I wasn't aware legal representation was necessary. Grace's tone remained pleasant. It became necessary when your family concealed fiduciary authority from my client while attempting to force unauthorized merger execution. Silence. Sharp and instant. Kurt moved toward them quickly. Can we do this privately? Lillian finally spoke. You already humiliated me publicly. Why stop now? The words landed harder than she expected. Kurt flinched visibly. Good. Let him feel even a fraction of what she carried for years. Vanessa appeared beside him moments later, stunning in a silver dress that probably cost more than Lillian's first apartment. But tonight, something looked different about her. Less confident, because legal exposure terrified people who built careers on image. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. You're creating unnecessary drama. Lillian stared at her calmly. No, she said softly. I discovered yours. That shut her up instantly. Across the ballroom, investors and executives pretended not to listen while clearly listening to everything. Whispers spread rapidly now. Something was wrong. Something legal. Something dangerous. Exactly the kind of scandal wealthy corporations feared most. Harrison approached at last. Unlike Valeria, he didn't bother pretending warmth. What do you want? The bluntness almost impressed Lillian. Grace answered instead. Transparency would be a good start. Harrison's jaw tightened. You're jeopardizing a billion-dollar transaction. Lillian met his eyes steadily. You jeopardized it when you hid documents tied to my legal authority. For the first time in years, Harrison Whitmore looked uncertain. Not angry, not superior. Uncertain. Because power shifted the moment someone stopped accepting the role designed for them. One of the merger attorneys hurried toward the group nervously. We have a problem. Everyone turned. The attorney swallowed hard. Carrington's legal department discovered missing authorization inconsistencies tied to the restructuring trust. The room went completely still. Lillian watched panic spread quietly across Kurt's face. There it was. The moment the illusion cracked publicly. Valeria stepped forward instantly. This can still be handled internally. Grace smiled faintly. Not anymore. More executives gathered nearby now. Questions spread rapidly. Confusion, concern, risk calculations. Because corporate loyalty vanished, the second money became vulnerable. Kurt looked directly at Lillian finally. Not arrogantly, not dismissively, desperately. Please, he said quietly, don't do this here. The sadness inside her chest surprised her, because once upon a time, hearing Kurt plead would have destroyed her resolve instantly. Now all she saw was a man finally terrified of consequences. You already did this, she whispered. Kurt stepped closer. We can fix it. Lillian shook her head slowly. No, you can't fix betrayal after the paperwork matters. That sentence hit him hard. She saw it, because it was true. If the merger had succeeded, Kurt would have discarded her without hesitation. Only now, when losing her carried financial devastation, did she suddenly matter again. And that realization killed whatever remained of her marriage more completely than the affair itself. Grace opened the leather portfolio calmly, then placed the original trust agreement onto the table in front of the merger attorneys. Every conversation nearby stopped instantly. The lead attorney picked up the document with visibly shaking hands. Oh my God. Another attorney leaned over, then another. Rapid whispers erupted immediately afterward. Why wasn't this disclosed? She's still active fiduciary. This changes the entire approval structure. We can't close tonight. The ballroom energy shifted from celebration to crisis in seconds. And standing in the center of it all, Lillian suddenly understood something powerful. The woman they spent years making feel invisible had just become the most important person in the room. The merger collapsed within 43 minutes. That was how long it took for panic to infect the ballroom completely. Investors stopped smiling first. Then the attorneys stopped pretending the situation was manageable. By the time Carrington Urban Capital's executives quietly exited through a private conference room, everyone in the Whitmore camp understood the same terrifying truth. Without Lillian Hicks, there was no deal. The ballroom that had glittered with arrogance an hour earlier now felt suffocating. Champagne glasses sat abandoned across cocktail tables. Whispers spread everywhere. People avoided eye contact with the Whitmores, the way passengers avoided looking at someone having a breakdown on an airplane. And through all of it, Lillian stood strangely calm. Not happy, not vindictive, just awake. Grace remained beside her like a perfectly sharpened weapon. Kurt approached carefully once the investors disappeared into private legal meetings. For the first time since she met him, he looked genuinely frightened. Not polished, not charismatic, human. His tie hung loose now, hair slightly disheveled, panic visible beneath every movement. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Grace immediately stepped forward, not without counsel. Kurt ignored her eyes, locked only on Lillian. "Please." The word sounded fragile. Years ago, it would have shattered her. Tonight, it only exhausted her. Lillian nodded once toward an empty private lounge beside the ballroom. Grace studied her carefully. "I'll be outside the door." Kurt and Lillian entered the room silently. The moment the door shut, the silence between them became unbearable. A city skyline stretched behind Kurt through towering glass windows, while Manhattan lights flickered beneath the storm-dark sky. For a second, the image reminded Lillian painfully of the man she once loved. The man who used to dance with her barefoot in tiny apartments before money poisoned everything. Then he spoke, and the illusion disappeared again. "You blindsided us." "Us. Interesting choice. Not me. Not our marriage. Us. The company, the family, the machine." Lillian crossed her arms slowly. "You hid legal authority from me for years." Kurt dragged a hand through his hair. "We were trying to protect the company." "No," she said quietly. "You were protecting yourselves." He looked away. And somehow that hurt more than yelling would have, because deep down, Kurt knew she was right. He walked closer carefully. "Lillian, this merger failing destroys everything." She laughed softly. "That sounds familiar. What's that supposed to mean?" "You said the exact same thing about our marriage." The words landed hard. Kurt visibly flinched. Good. Let him finally sit inside discomfort instead of outsourcing it onto her. "You know I never wanted this." Lillian stared at him in disbelief. "You slept with another woman for 6 months. It wasn't supposed to happen." That's what weak people say when they make selfish choices. Silence. Kurt's jaw tightened. "You think this is easy for me?" The audacity nearly made her laugh again. Easy for him, as if betrayal injured the betrayer equally. Lillian stepped closer slowly. "You let your family throw me out like garbage. You refused to cooperate." "There it is," she whispered. "You still think this is about paperwork." Kurt looked exhausted suddenly. "No, I think this is about you wanting revenge. The sentence settled heavily between them, because part of her wondered if he was right. Not about revenge, about anger. She was angry. God, she was furious. At him. At herself. At all the years she abandoned pieces of herself, trying to become lovable enough for people incapable of valuing loyalty. But revenge. No. If she truly wanted revenge, she could have destroyed the merger quietly without warning. Instead, she walked into that ballroom openly, gave them a chance to face what they'd done. You know the saddest part? Lillian asked softly. Kurt looked at her warily. I would have given you everything if you'd just been honest. Something cracked across his face then. Real emotion this time. Pain. Regret. Too late. I did love you, he whispered. Lillian's throat tightened painfully, because she believed him. That was the tragedy. Kurt probably had loved her once, just not enough to protect her when power, ambition, and ego demanded sacrifice. Love without loyalty eventually became meaningless. You only miss my value now that losing me has a price tag attached, she said quietly. The sentence hit him like a slap. Kurt sat heavily on the leather couch, staring down at his hands. My father's losing his mind out there. Lillian felt nothing hearing that, and that scared her slightly. Once Harrison Whitmore's approval felt terrifyingly important. Now he was simply another man who benefited from her silence. Kurt looked up again. What do you want finally? Not manipulation, not excuses, a real question. Lillian took a slow breath. I want a forensic audit. Kurt blinked. What I want every concealed disclosure reviewed, every offshore transfer examined, every fiduciary omission investigated. His face paled instantly. Interesting. Very interesting. Because that reaction wasn't about embarrassment, it was fear. Real fear. Kurt, she said carefully, what else did your family hide? He stood abruptly. Nothing. Too fast? Too defensive. Lillian noticed immediately. And so did he. The silence afterward became dangerous. Kurt, it's complicated. No. Her voice hardened. You don't get to use that phrase anymore. He turned toward the window, breathing unevenly. For a moment, she almost pitied him. Almost. Then she remembered him standing silently while security escorted her out of the mansion, and the pity died instantly. Kurt finally spoke without turning around. My father moved money during the restructuring years. The room went still. Lillian's pulse slowed unnaturally. How much money? I don't know exactly. Lie. She could hear it. Kurt. He closed his eyes briefly. There were offshore accounts. Every instinct inside her sharpened instantly. And he said it was temporary asset protection. Lillian felt sick. Not because wealthy corporations hid money. Because she suddenly understood why they were so desperate to control the documents. The trust wasn't just tied to the merger. It was tied to years of concealed financial movement. Possibly fraud. Possibly worse. You knew. Kurt turned toward her quickly. No, not everything. I swear. But enough. Silence confirmed it. God. The man she married had spent years helping conceal financial deception while sleeping beside her every night, pretending they were building a life together. Lillian felt something inside her finally detach emotionally. Not explode. Detach. Quietly. Like a rope snapping under too much weight. You should go, Kurt whispered suddenly. She frowned. What you don't understand how ugly this can become. Fear slid through her body. Not because of the threat itself, because Kurt sounded sincere. My mother will never let this destroy the family. Lillian stared at him carefully. Is that supposed to scare me? Kurt looked devastated. It's supposed to protect you. For a split second, she saw the old version of him again, the man she once trusted completely. And somehow that hurt worse than the affair, because fragments of him were still there, buried beneath weakness, buried beneath ambition, buried too deep to save. Lillian stepped toward the door slowly, then paused. Without turning around, she said softly, You know what Your biggest mistake was? Kurt's voice came quietly behind her. What Lillian looked back, finally. You taught me how little I meant to all of you. A pause. Then, and once someone stops being afraid to lose love, they become impossible to control. She walked out of the room without looking back, but just before the door closed behind her, she heard something she never expected. Kurt crying. The media got the story 48 hours later. Not the full truth, not yet, but enough. Enough for headlines, enough for panic, enough for Whitmore Holdings stock to drop 12% before noon. Grace stood beside the television in her office, while financial networks dissected the failed merger with the kind of delighted cruelty reserved for wealthy people finally falling apart publicly. Anonymous legal concerns tied to concealed fiduciary authority, possible disclosure, irregularities, internal instability at Whitmore Holdings. Lillian muted the television eventually. The noise made her tired. She sat near the conference table, wearing one of Grace's spare cashmere sweaters, staring blankly at the Manhattan skyline while rain streaked across the windows again. Everything felt unreal now. 3 weeks ago, she was grocery shopping for a husband secretly planning to replace her. Now, corporate journalists debated her legal authority on national television. Grace placed another folder in front of her. We found the offshore accounts. Lillian looked up slowly. Something in Grace's expression told her this was worse than before. How bad? Grace opened the folder carefully. Worse than I expected. The documents inside revealed years of hidden transfers routed through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. Millions. Then tens of millions. Then more? Lillian stared at the numbers numbly. Harrison authorized all this? Yes. And Kurt Grace hesitated. The hesitation itself answered enough. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. God. She remembered nights Kurt came home tense and irritable during restructuring years. The drinking, the distance, the sudden obsession with protecting the family legacy. At the time, she thought he was overwhelmed. Now she wondered how much guilt had already been rotting inside him. He knew enough, Grace said carefully. Maybe not every detail, but enough to understand something illegal was happening. Lillian nodded once silently. Oddly, that hurt less than the affair now, because betrayal had layers, and once someone shattered your trust completely, additional fractures stopped surprising you. Grace sat across from her. There's more. Lillian almost laughed. Of course there was. There are internal communications discussing contingency liability. What does that mean? Grace slid another page toward her. Lillian read slowly. Then her blood ran cold. If fiduciary complications escalate, legal exposure may be redirected toward LH due to signature authority positioning. She reread the sentence again. Then again? No. Grace's voice softened slightly. I'm sorry. Lillian stared at the page in horror. They were going to blame me? The realization hollowed her out instantly. Not just use her, sacrifice her. If the merger collapsed, or regulators investigated, the Whitmores planned to redirect legal responsibility toward the woman they already positioned as emotionally unstable and uninformed. Her stomach twisted violently. All those conversations. All those moments Kurt called her dramatic. Valeria painting her as irrational. The forced isolation. The narrative had already been under construction. Lillian stood abruptly and walked toward the windows, trying to breathe. For several seconds, she couldn't speak, because this wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was strategic destruction. Grace remained quiet behind her. Finally, Lillian whispered, "He knew." Grace didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Tears burned suddenly behind Lillian's eyes. Not delicate tears, not heartbreak, grief. The kind that arrived when illusion finally died completely. I loved him so much, she whispered brokenly. Grace's reflection met hers in the glass. I know. No, you don't understand. Lillian laughed shakily through tears. I defended him against everyone, even myself. That was the cruelest part. The self-betrayal. All those years she ignored instincts to preserve a version of love that only existed in fragments. Grace approached slowly. What they did says everything about them, she said quietly. Not about your worth. Lillian wiped her face angrily. I should have seen it sooner. Most emotionally manipulative relationships only become obvious once survival mode ends. The sentence settled painfully deep. Survival mode? That was exactly what marriage became. Appeasing, avoiding conflict, working harder to earn basic kindness. Lillian looked down at the documents again. They really would have sacrificed her. The woman who saved their company. The woman who protected their son. The woman who spent years shrinking herself to fit inside their approval. Something inside her hardened permanently then, not into cruelty, into clarity. A knock interrupted the silence. Grace's assistant stepped inside carefully. Mr. Whitmore is here. Lillian's stomach tightened instantly. Grace frowned. Which one, Harrison? Interesting. Not Kurt, not Valeria. The patriarch himself. Grace looked at Lillian. You don't have to see him. But Lillian already understood something important. People like Harrison Whitmore only appeared personally when desperation outweighed pride. Send him in. A minute later, Harrison entered the office wearing a charcoal overcoat and exhaustion carved deeply into his face. For the first time since Lillian met him, he looked old, not powerful. Old. His gaze landed on the folders spread across the table immediately, then on Lillian. Silence stretched heavily. Finally he spoke. You should have contacted me directly. Lillian almost smiled, still trying to position himself above the situation, still trying to control the room. Grace remained standing beside the table. You concealed fiduciary authority and attempted liability transfer, she said coldly. Direct contact seemed inappropriate. Harrison ignored her. His eyes stayed locked on Lillian. I know you're angry. Angry. Such a small word for what they'd done. Lillian folded her arms tightly. You framed me. A flicker crossed his face. Not guilt. Calculation. No decisions were finalized. The sentence shocked even Grace into silence briefly. Because it wasn't denial, it was justification. Lillian stared at him in disbelief. You really think that makes this better? Harrison sighed heavily. You don't understand the pressure corporations face. There it is again, Lillian whispered. Every horrible thing becomes acceptable because rich people call it pressure. His jaw tightened. The company employs thousands of people, and your solution was sacrificing me? Harrison stepped closer. You were legally positioned already. It would have minimized exposure. The calmness of that statement chilled her. Minimized exposure, as if destroying her life was simply efficient risk management. Lillian suddenly understood Kurt better. This was the environment that raised him, a family where image mattered more than humanity, where emotions became liabilities, where love was transactional. Harrison's voice lowered. You still have an opportunity to fix this. Grace laughed once sharply. Incredible. Harrison ignored her. We can negotiate privately, quietly. Lillian looked at him for a long moment, then asked softly, Did you ever see me as family? The question visibly caught him off guard, because people like Harrison understood leverage better than emotion. After a pause too long to survive, honestly, he answered, You were useful to this family. Useful. There it was. Not loved, not valued, useful. Something inside Lillian finally went still. No more confusion, no more hoping, no more grieving who the Whitmores pretended to be. She looked directly at Harrison. I think that's the saddest thing anyone's ever said to me. For the first time, discomfort flickered across his expression. Real discomfort. Because even powerful men sometimes realized too late when they'd revealed something monstrous about themselves. Grace stepped forward calmly. My client will proceed with forensic review and legal action. Harrison's face darkened. You'll destroy the company. Lillian met his gaze steadily. No, she said quietly. You already did that the moment you decided I was disposable. Harrison stared at her another long moment, then finally nodded once, not respectfully, resigned, as though realizing the woman they underestimated had become the one thing their power couldn't intimidate anymore. When he left the office, silence lingered heavily behind him. Lillian sat down slowly afterward, emotionally exhausted. Grace studied her carefully. You okay? Lillian looked toward the skyline again. No, she admitted softly. Then after a pause, but for the first time in years, I think I'm finally becoming free. The threat came 3 nights later. Not from Harrison, not from Kurt, from Valeria, of course. Lillian had started recognizing the different ways powerful people used fear. Harrison preferred negotiation disguised as logic. Kurt used emotional confusion, but Valeria weaponized intimidation like an art form. It was nearly midnight when Lillian returned to her temporary apartment overlooking the Hudson River. Grace insisted she stay somewhere private after the financial investigation became public internally. The apartment was modern, cold, and mostly empty, but it was peaceful. No tension humming beneath the walls, no pretending, no constantly monitoring everyone else's moods to survive the day. Lillian had just kicked off her heels when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. For a second, she considered ignoring it. Then instinct whispered, answer. Hello, silence. Then Valeria's voice emerged smooth as poison. You've embarrassed my family long enough. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. Not hurt, just tired. You framed me for fraud. You're being dramatic again. The old manipulation no longer worked the same way. That realization almost fascinated Lillian. Weeks ago, those words would have triggered panic, self-doubt, the desperate urge to defend herself. Now they just sounded predictable. You raised a son who betrayed his wife while helping conceal financial crimes, Lillian said calmly. I think we're past dramatic. Valeria's voice hardened instantly. You have no idea how ugly powerful people can become when threatened. There it was. The threat beneath the elegance. Lillian walked slowly toward the apartment windows overlooking the river lights. You already took everything you thought mattered to me. No, Valeria replied softly. You still have your reputation. A chill slid through Lillian's body. Not fear exactly, recognition. Valeria wasn't bluffing. Women like her survived by controlling narratives, society connections, charity boards, private schools, media relationships. She could destroy people socially without ever raising her voice. You spent years benefiting from this family, Valeria continued. Be careful before pretending you're innocent. Lillian gripped the phone tighter. Innocent of what? Pause. Then if I fall, I won't fall alone. The line went dead. For several seconds, Lillian stood frozen beside the windows, then slowly lowered the phone. Valeria wasn't threatening lawsuits. She was threatening war. The next morning, Grace listened silently while Lillian repeated the conversation. Then the attorney leaned back in her chair. Good. Lillian blinked. Good. Grace nodded once. Threats mean panic. It was strange how differently powerful women interpreted fear. Lillian still reacted emotionally. Grace reacted strategically. She's trying to destabilize you before litigation progresses, Grace continued, which means we're getting close to something valuable. Lillian sat quietly, twisting the edge of her coffee cup. I'm tired. Grace's expression softened slightly. I know. No, I mean really tired. Lillian stared down at the table. I spent so many years surviving emotionally that now I don't even know what normal feels like anymore. The admission sat heavily between them. Grace folded her hands. You know what emotional manipulation does to intelligent women? Lillian looked up. It teaches them to distrust their own instincts. God. That hit too hard. Because it was true. Lillian used to be sharp, confident, intuitive. Then, slowly over years, she became someone who double checked every feeling before trusting it. Was Valeria really insulting me? Am I overreacting? Maybe Kurt's just stressed. Maybe I'm too sensitive. That was how emotionally controlling families worked. Not through constant screaming, through erosion. Grace stood. Come with me. An hour later, Lillian found herself inside a quiet therapy office on the Upper West Side. Warm lighting, soft gray furniture, bookshelves lined with psychology texts. Dr. Naomi Bennett greeted her with gentle eyes and zero judgment. At first, Lillian almost refused to sit down. Therapy felt embarrassing somehow, like admitting weakness. But halfway through the session, she realized something devastating. She had spent 7 years being emotionally managed by people who benefited from her exhaustion, and she never once stopped to ask herself what she needed. Dr. Bennett listened carefully while Lillian described the marriage, the gaslighting, the constant pressure to be agreeable, the humiliation, the affair. Finally, the therapist asked quietly, "When was the last time you felt emotionally safe?" Lillian opened her mouth, then stopped, because she genuinely didn't know. Tears burned unexpectedly behind her eyes. "Oh," she whispered. That tiny realization broke something open inside her. Not dramatically, gently, like finally acknowledging an old injury instead of pretending it never hurt. Later that evening, Lillian walked alone through Central Park while autumn winds scattered leaves across the pavement. For the first time in weeks, nobody demanded anything from her. No legal updates, no emotional confrontation, no Whitmore crisis, just silence. And strangely, the silence no longer felt lonely. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Kurt. She almost ignored it. Almost. But something inside her needed closure, not reconciliation. Closure. Hello, Kurt sounded exhausted immediately. Mom contacted you, didn't she? Yes. A long silence followed. She shouldn't have threatened you. Lillian laughed quietly. You say that like you don't know exactly who she is. That's not fair. There it is again, she whispered. Every time I describe reality, you call it unfair. Kurt exhaled heavily. I'm trying to fix this. No, Lillian said softly. You're trying to control damage. That silence afterward told her she was right. Kurt's voice lowered. You think I'm a terrible person. Lillian stopped walking beneath a canopy of gold leaves. The old version of her would have rushed to comfort him. Even now, even after everything. That instinct to emotionally protect him still lingered like muscle memory. But healing, she realized, sometimes meant resisting the urge to rescue people from consequences they created themselves. I think you became too comfortable watching other people sacrifice themselves for you, she said quietly. Kurt sounded shattered. I never wanted to hurt you, but you kept choosing yourself every time hurting me became easier. The honesty of that statement silenced both of them. Traffic hummed faintly nearby. Somewhere in the park, someone laughed. Life continued around heartbreak so casually. That always felt strange. Kurt spoke again finally. Dad's preparing settlement negotiations. Of course he is. He's scared. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. Once upon a time, hearing Harrison Whitmore was scared would have felt satisfying. Now it just felt sad. All that power, all that money, and still emotionally hollow enough to destroy people who loved them. Kurt, she said carefully, did you ever actually plan a future with Vanessa? The question surprised him. I thought I did. And now silence. Then quietly, I don't even know who I am anymore. The pain in his voice sounded real, but real pain didn't erase real betrayal. That was another lesson Lillian was finally learning. She resumed walking slowly. I hope you figure it out someday. Kurt's breathing caught slightly. Lillian. But she ended the call before he could finish. Not cruelly, not dramatically. Just finally understanding that closure didn't require endless emotional bleeding. That night, Grace arrived at the apartment carrying another stack of investigation files. There's good news and bad news. Lillian smiled faintly. I'm almost afraid to ask. The good news? Grace sat down across from her. We found an executive willing to cooperate against Valeria. Lillian frowned. Who? Grace slid a folder across the table. Harrison Whitmore. Lillian stared at the name in shock. What? Grace nodded slowly. Your father-in-law is preparing to hand over evidence. The room went silent. Because if Harrison Whitmore was turning against Valeria, the Whitmore empire wasn't just cracking anymore. It was collapsing from the inside. Harrison Whitmore looked nothing like the man Lillian remembered. The last time she saw him in person, he stood inside Grace Monroe's office, speaking about sacrificing her life like it was a practical business adjustment. Now sitting across from her in a private conference room, 2 weeks later, he looked hollowed out, older, smaller somehow. Power had drained out of him the moment control disappeared. Rain hammered softly against the Manhattan windows, while untouched coffee cooled between them. Grace remained at the far end of the table, reviewing documents, silently giving Harrison exactly enough space to talk without forgetting he was under legal scrutiny. Harrison removed his glasses slowly. I suppose there's no version of this conversation where you don't hate me. Lillian stared at him quietly. The strange thing was, she didn't hate him anymore. Hatred required emotional attachment. And somewhere between the affair, the fraud, and the attempted scapegoating, something inside her detached permanently from the Whitmores. I don't think I know you well enough to hate you, she answered honestly. The words landed harder than anger would have. Harrison lowered his gaze briefly. I underestimated you. Grace gave a dry laugh from across the room. That's becoming a recurring theme. Harrison ignored her. He slid a thick folder across the table toward Lillian. Everything is in there. Internal emails, transfer approvals, private communications, evidence. Lillian flipped slowly through the pages while her stomach tightened. Some emails implicated Valeria directly in concealment strategies. Others revealed Vanessa helped suppress fiduciary disclosures during merger preparations. And then Kurt's name appeared. Repeatedly. Lillian stopped breathing for a second. Not because she was shocked anymore, because some wounded part of her still hoped there would be limits to his involvement. There weren't. She read one email silently. Need Lillian cooperative until merger finalization. Emotional management, preferable over confrontation. Lillian closed the folder immediately. Her hands shook slightly. Emotional management. God. They talked about her like a liability requiring containment. Not a wife. Not a human being. A variable. Grace watched her carefully. You okay? Lillian nodded automatically, then realized she wasn't. No, she admitted softly. Harrison looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time. I didn't know they phrased it like that. Lillian looked up sharply. You were included in the emails. A shadow crossed his face. Yes. The honesty almost made it worse. No denial, no excuses. Just quiet acknowledgement of how monstrous they'd become. Harrison leaned back heavily. You need to understand something about families like ours. Lillian almost smiled sadly. Everything sounds more horrifying after that sentence. To her surprise, Harrison actually looked ashamed. We taught Kurt that protecting the company justified everything. The words hung heavily in the room. And suddenly, Lillian saw it clearly. The Whitmores didn't create loyalty. They created survivalists. People willing to betray love if power demanded it. Harrison rubbed tired eyes. I spent 30 years building Whitmore Holdings. His voice lowered. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people separately from usefulness. Lillian thought about all the years she spent begging internally for scraps of approval from this family. The dinners, the criticisms, the emotional starvation disguised as sophistication. And suddenly she felt overwhelming grief for the woman she used to be. Not weak, just desperate to be loved by emotionally bankrupt people. Grace closed another file sharply. There's enough here to bury half the executive board. Harrison nodded once. I know. Why are you cooperating now? Lillian asked quietly. That question seemed to age him further, because Kurt finally looked at me like he hated me. The answer stunned her. Harrison stared out the rain-covered windows. He came into my office 3 nights ago and asked me if I ever planned to let him become a decent man. Silence filled the room. Lillian swallowed hard. He said that, yes. For the first time in weeks, genuine sadness pierced through her anger toward Kurt, because she knew exactly what he meant. People didn't become emotionally hollow by accident. Someone taught them love was conditional. Someone trained them to prioritize power over honesty. That didn't excuse Kurt, but it explained him. Harrison's voice roughened slightly. I think he finally realized what we turned him into. Lillian looked down quietly. Part of healing she was learning meant accepting that understanding someone's pain didn't require accepting their cruelty. Grace stood and moved toward the window. What matters now is damage control. Harrison gave a bitter smile. There's no controlling this anymore. No, Grace corrected calmly. There's protecting innocent people. That shifted the conversation instantly, because behind every corporate scandal sat employees, assistants, managers, receptionists, families, depending on paychecks. Lillian thought about the staff at Whitmore Holdings, people who had always treated her kindly, even while the Whitmores humiliated her. They'll lose everything if the company collapses, she whispered. Grace nodded. Potentially. Harrison looked at her carefully then, almost cautiously. You still care. The statement carried genuine confusion, as though compassion after betrayal no longer made sense to him. Lillian met his gaze steadily. I refuse to become like your family. That sentence broke something in Harrison's expression. Real regret. Not strategic regret, human regret. The kind arriving decades too late. 3 days later, negotiations began privately. Not about saving the merger. That was dead. This was about survival. Whitmore Holdings agreed to full forensic cooperation in exchange for limited civil protections. Several executives prepared resignations immediately. Vanessa Cole disappeared from public view entirely after legal ethics review opened against her law license, and Kurt resigned voluntarily. Lillian learned that from financial news alerts while sitting in Dr. Bennett's therapy office. She stared at the headlines silently. Kurt Whitmore steps down amid internal investigation. Dr. Bennett studied her carefully. How does it feel? Lillian expected satisfaction, vindication, triumph. Instead, all she felt was tired sadness. He lost everything trying to become someone his family would finally respect. The therapist nodded slowly. And what did you lose? Lillian looked down at her hands. Myself. The honesty of that answer hurt, because it was true. The marriage hadn't only broken her heart, it disconnected her from her own instincts, confidence, and worth. Dr. Bennett leaned forward slightly. And what are you rebuilding now? Lillian thought about that quietly. Boundaries, peace, self-respect, the right to stop earning love through suffering. Later that evening, Kurt requested one final meeting. Grace hated the idea immediately. Emotionally dangerous, she warned. She deserves closure, Dr. Bennett countered calmly. So now Lillian sat across from the man she once imagined growing old inside a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking Manhattan. Kurt looked thinner. The confidence that used to define him had vanished completely. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, he broke first. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. Months ago, hearing that would have saved him in her mind. Now it only hurt, because he realized her value only after destroying the relationship. Kurt looked shattered. I keep replaying everything he whispered. Every moment I should have defended you. Lillian stared at the city lights silently. You know what the saddest part is? Kurt swallowed hard. What? I would have stayed through almost anything. Her voice cracked softly. If you had just loved me honestly. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Real tears. Real grief. Too late. Kurt laughed shakily through them. I don't think I knew how. That honesty almost destroyed her, because part of her believed it completely. The Whitmores taught survival. Not love, not loyalty, not emotional courage. Kurt wiped at his face roughly. I'm sorry. Lillian looked at him for a very long time, then finally answered the truth. I know. And somehow that hurt even worse than hatred ever could. The divorce became official on a gray Thursday morning in March. No dramatic courtroom scene, no screaming, no glamorous revenge dress, just signatures, quiet voices, and the strange emptiness that comes when something you fought to save finally dies for real. Lillian sat beside Grace Monroe inside a private legal conference room while attorneys reviewed the final settlement documents. Outside Manhattan moved normally. People crossed streets carrying coffee cups. Taxi horns echoed through the city. Somewhere nearby, someone was probably falling in love while another person was getting divorced. Life kept moving, regardless of heartbreak. That still amazed her. Everything looks clean, Grace said softly while sliding the papers toward her. The trust protections remain intact. Your assets are secured, and all liability releases are finalized. Lillian nodded quietly. The settlement had shocked everyone involved. She could have taken far more. After the Whitmore scandal exploded publicly, several board members privately urged her to destroy the family financially. She didn't. Not because the Whitmores deserved mercy, because she finally understood revenge and healing were not the same thing. Hurting them forever would not repair what she lost. The judge entered, briefly finalized the dissolution, and just like that, 7 years ended in under 15 minutes. Mrs. Lillian Whitmore disappeared legally. Lillian Hicks remained. The realization felt unexpectedly emotional. Not because she missed the marriage, because she missed the version of herself who once believed love alone could make emotionally broken people choose kindness. Afterward, Grace drove her back to the Upper West Side apartment she'd rented 2 months earlier. It wasn't massive, it wasn't flashy, but every object inside it belonged entirely to her. No silent judgment, no performance, no constantly feeling like a guest inside someone else's world. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla candles and fresh coffee now. Therapy had taught Lillian small things mattered. Soft blankets, open windows, music while cooking. Peace wasn't dramatic. It was gentle. And after years inside emotional chaos, gentleness felt almost unfamiliar. That evening, Lillian stood barefoot in her kitchen, making pasta, while jazz played softly from a speaker near the counter. Rain tapped lightly against the windows again. For once, the sound no longer reminded her of being thrown out of the mansion. Now it just sounded peaceful. Her phone buzzed. Grace. You busy cooking? A pause. Look at you becoming emotionally stable. Lillian laughed softly. I'm trying. Grace's tone warmed slightly. There's something you should know. Lillian leaned against the counter. What happened? The new interim board at Whitmore Holdings contacted me. Her stomach tightened instinctively. Even now, the family name still triggered anxiety. What do they want? They want you? Lillian frowned. What? Grace sounded amused. The company is rebuilding compliance structure after the investigation fallout. Apparently, half the board thinks you're the only competent adult associated with the corporation. Lillian stared out the rain-covered windows silently. Months ago, she would have heard validation in that offer. Now, all she felt was exhaustion. I don't want to go back there. You wouldn't be returning as a wife? The sentence landed quietly. Grace continued. You'd return as someone they answer to. Lillian laughed once under her breath. The irony almost felt cinematic. Years spent begging to be respected inside rooms she now had the power to control. No, she said finally. I'm done tying my worth to that family. Grace sounded proud. Good answer. After the call ended, Lillian carried her dinner to the couch and sat watching city lights shimmer through the windows. The silence no longer scared her. That might have been the biggest transformation of all. Loneliness used to terrify her. Now she understood the difference between solitude and emotional abandonment. One healed you, the other hollowed you out. Weeks passed quietly after that. Lillian continued therapy twice a week. She started consulting independently, again helping smaller firms with compliance restructuring and ethical governance. The work felt good, not because of money, because she remembered she was talented, competent, intelligent outside the identity of someone's wife. One morning, while reviewing client files at a cafe in Soho, she caught herself smiling without forcing it. The realization startled her. Healing didn't arrive dramatically either, apparently. Sometimes it happened in tiny moments. A full night of sleep, laughing naturally, walking into a room without fearing criticism. Slowly, Lillian began rebuilding herself from the inside outward, not into a harder woman, into a freer one. Then one afternoon, nearly 4 months after the divorce finalized, Kurt appeared unexpectedly outside her office building. Lillian froze when she saw him standing near the entrance beneath the autumn sunlight. He looked different, simpler somehow, less polished. No expensive tailored coat, no corporate arrogance, just a tired man carrying regret too heavy to hide anymore. For a second, old pain flickered inside her chest, then faded. Kurt stepped forward carefully. I know I shouldn't have come. Then why did you? He looked down briefly. I wanted to see if you were okay. The old version of her would have melted hearing that. Now she simply noticed the sadness in his eyes without absorbing responsibility for it. I'm okay, she answered honestly. Kurt nodded slowly. That's good. Silence stretched awkwardly between them. Traffic moved around them, while strangers hurried past without noticing two people standing in the ruins of a once expensive marriage. Finally, Kurt laughed softly under his breath. You look lighter. Lillian considered that. He was right. Not happier all the time, not magically healed, but lighter. Like she'd been carrying invisible emotional weight for years without realizing how heavy it became. I think I stopped trying to earn love from people, determined to withhold it, she said quietly. Kurt flinched slightly. The truth still hurt him. Good. Some truths should. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I'm in therapy now. The statement surprised her. Kurt gave a faint, humorless smile. Turns out emotional repression and corporate narcissism aren't healthy personality traits. Despite everything, a small laugh escaped her. Real. Warm. Kurt smiled sadly, hearing it. God. For one dangerous second, she saw the man she originally fell in love with again. Not the coward, not the betrayer. Just the wounded human underneath all the conditioning. And that was the final heartbreak. Knowing he could have become better sooner if he'd chosen courage over comfort. I'm sorry, he whispered again. Lillian looked at him gently this time. Not lovingly, not angrily. Just honestly. I know you are. The wind moved softly between them. Kurt swallowed hard. I don't expect forgiveness. Good. Another tiny smile touched his face. You always were smarter than me. No, Lillian said quietly. I just stopped abandoning myself. That sentence settled deeply between them, because ultimately that had been the real tragedy of the marriage. Not just Kurt betraying her, Lillian betraying herself to keep someone else comfortable. Kurt nodded once, slowly, then stepped back. I hope you find someone who loves you correctly someday. Lillian looked toward the bright Manhattan skyline. For the first time in her life, the thought no longer felt urgent, because she was finally learning something powerful. A woman who knows her own worth stops treating love like survival. And maybe that was the beginning of real peace. 1 year later, Lillian Hicks no longer flinched when people said her name. That surprised her sometimes. For so long, her identity existed attached to someone else's approval. Kurt's wife, the Whitmore daughter-in-law, the quiet woman standing politely at the edge of powerful rooms. Now people said her name differently, with respect. The black town car pulled up outside the Midtown Conference Center just after sunrise. Manhattan glowed gold beneath early morning light while camera crews prepared outside the entrance. A massive banner stretched across the building, Women in Leadership and Corporate Ethics Summit, featuring keynote speaker Lillian Hicks. She stared at the sign for a long moment through the tinted car window. Not because of ego, because healing sometimes felt surreal when you remembered how close you came to disappearing emotionally. Her assistant Maya smiled beside her. You nervous? Lillian laughed softly. A little. That's good. Means you still care. The summit invitation arrived 6 months earlier after several interviews discussing corporate ethics and emotional manipulation inside professional environments unexpectedly went viral online. At first, Lillian almost declined every appearance. She hated attention. But then thousands of women started messaging her privately. Women trapped in marriages where they constantly minimized themselves to keep peace. Women financially manipulated by partners. Women apologizing for having emotional needs. Women who believed kindness meant endurance. And suddenly, Lillian realized her story was bigger than the Whitmores. It was about what happened when intelligent women forgot they were allowed to take up space. The car door opened. Cold autumn air rushed toward her as photographers snapped pictures immediately. Flashbulbs, voices calling her name. A year ago, that attention would have terrified her. Now she simply adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored coat and walked forward calmly. Inside the conference center, executives, journalists, entrepreneurs, and attorneys filled the massive ballroom. The energy buzzed with ambition and conversation. But unlike the Whitmore events she used to attend, this room felt different. Nobody wanted her smaller here. Nobody needed her silent to feel powerful themselves. Maya leaned closer as they walked backstage. There's someone here asking for you privately. Lillian frowned slightly. Who? Maya hesitated. Kurt. The name no longer shattered her heartbeat the way it once did. Still, emotion moved quietly through her chest. Not longing. Memory. Some loves left scars, even after healing formed around them. He's backstage. Maya nodded carefully. You want me to send him away? Lillian thought for a moment, then shook her head. No, it's okay. Kurt stood near the hallway windows overlooking the city skyline when she found him. For a second, neither of them spoke. Time had changed him. He looked healthier now somehow, still sad in certain ways, but steadier. Therapy suited him. Consequences suited him too. He wore a simple charcoal coat instead of designer arrogance. His posture no longer carried inherited superiority, just humanity. When he looked at her, genuine admiration softened his expression. You look happy. Lillian considered the statement carefully. I think I look peaceful. Kurt smiled faintly. Yeah. A pause. That too. Silence settled gently between them. Not hostile anymore, just honest. He glanced toward the ballroom where people waited for her speech. Look at you. Lillian laughed quietly. That sounds dangerous coming from you. I mean it. His eyes met hers. You built something beautiful after all this. Emotion flickered unexpectedly inside her chest, because once upon a time, all she wanted was for Kurt to see her value. Now he finally did. And strangely, she no longer needed it. That's the irony, she admitted softly. The moment I stopped begging people to choose me, my whole life changed. Kurt nodded slowly, like he carried that sentence somewhere painful inside himself. How's your mother? Lillian asked carefully. A shadow crossed his face, still blaming everyone else. Some people never changed. They only grew older inside the same emotional prison. And your father? Kurt looked out the window briefly. He retired completely. A faint, humorless smile appeared. Turns out losing control of everything forces perspective. Lillian absorbed that quietly. The Whitmore empire still existed in reduced form after restructuring, but the illusion surrounding the family had shattered permanently. No more untouchable perfection. No more polished lies, hiding emotional rot underneath. Just people. Flawed. Lonely. Human. Kurt looked back at her carefully. You know, losing you forced me to confront who I became. Lillian stayed silent. He continued. For years, I thought love meant someone staying no matter how badly you treated them. The honesty in his voice hurt in a completely different way now. Not like betrayal, like mourning wasted potential. I'm sorry for what my family did to you, he whispered, but I'm even more sorry for what I allowed. That mattered more somehow, because accountability sounded different than regret. Lillian smiled sadly. I know. A stage coordinator appeared suddenly near the hallway entrance. Miss Hicks, we're ready for you. Lillian nodded. As she turned toward the ballroom, Kurt spoke one last time. You were the strongest person in that family. She paused, then looked back over her shoulder. No, she said gently. I was just the only one willing to heal. And with that, she walked toward the stage lights. The ballroom erupted into applause as Lillian stepped onto the platform. Hundreds of faces looked back at her expectantly. Women, men, young professionals, executives, people carrying invisible wounds behind polished smiles. Lillian stood at the podium quietly for a moment. 1 year ago, she stood in the rain outside a mansion, believing her life was over. Now she stood here entirely because she survived it. The irony almost made her emotional. She took a slow breath, then began. For a long time, she said calmly into the microphone, I thought being loved meant proving I was useful. The ballroom fell completely silent. Lillian continued. So I became smaller, easier, more agreeable. I confused self-sacrifice with loyalty because I believed good women endured quietly. Several people in the audience visibly reacted. She recognized that expression. Recognition, pain, truth. But eventually she said softly, I learned something life-changing. A pause. The people who benefit from your silence will always call your boundaries selfish. Stillness swallowed the room. Lillian looked across the audience steadily. And the moment I stopped begging to belong somewhere, I was merely tolerated. Emotion tightened her throat slightly. Was the moment I became impossible to erase. Thunderous applause exploded through the ballroom. But for once, the validation didn't feel like survival. It felt like freedom. Later that night, after interviews and photographs and endless conversations, Lillian finally returned home exhausted. Her apartment windows overlooked the glowing city while soft jazz played quietly in the background. She kicked off her heels, poured a glass of wine, and stood watching Manhattan breathe beneath the night sky. Peace. Real peace. Not perfection, not revenge, just peace. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. Sometimes the most painful heartbreak is not losing another person. It's realizing how much of yourself you lost, trying to be enough for people who were never capable of loving you correctly. Lillian's story is not just about betrayal, cheating, or revenge. It's about what happens when a kind woman spends years shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's expectations. She gave loyalty, sacrificed patience, and unconditional love to people who only valued her when they needed something from her. And sadly, that happens in real life more often than most people admit. One of the hardest lessons in life is understanding that being needed is not the same as being loved. Some people will keep you close, not because they cherish your heart, but because they benefit from your silence, your loyalty, your emotional labor, and your willingness to forgive endlessly. The moment you finally choose yourself, they suddenly call you selfish. The moment you create boundaries, they accuse you of changing. But protecting your peace is not cruelty. Walking away from disrespect is not weakness. And losing people who only loved the version of you that tolerated mistreatment is not a loss. It's freedom. Lillian didn't become powerful because she destroyed the Whitmores. She became powerful the moment she stopped begging for acceptance from people determined to undervalue her. Real healing began when she realized her worth did not depend on a marriage, a wealthy family, or someone finally choosing her. It came from choosing herself. If this story touched you emotionally, let it remind you that kindness should never cost your self respect. Love should feel safe, honest, and mutual, not exhausting. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is walk away before they completely disappear inside a toxic relationship. If you've ever experienced betrayal, emotional manipulation, or had to rebuild yourself after heartbreak, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional drama stories with healing justice and powerful life lessons, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for more unforgettable stories.